Hello, everyone. Welcome to APQC's webinar, Supply Chain Benchmarking: What, Why, and How. I'm Marisa Brown, APQC Senior Principal Research Lead for Supply Chain Management, and I'm going to be sharing some highlights and insights with you from our supply chain benchmarking research. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to hit some of the key points related to supply chain benchmarking. And just so you know, for reference, everyone who's registered for the webinar will receive a copy of my slides and recording for reference afterwards. I'm going to start by focusing on understanding the what and the why of supply chain benchmarking, followed by the how to benchmark in supply chain. And I'll touch on the 4 phases of APQC's methodology: plan, collect, analyze, and adapt. And I'm also going to reference the benchmarking code of conduct, because that's an important underpinning that contributes to ethical and efficient benchmarking. So let's start with an overview of supply chain benchmarking. And much of the information in this section is drawn from benchmarks and data we collected within the past year. So what is benchmarking? Just so we're all on the same page, at its heart, it is a continuous learning process. Benchmarking is basically a way to say we want to understand our own organization's performance and then learn from others that hopefully are better than we are, and then adapt those practices and processes for our own organization's outcomes. You can benchmark internally across different units and parts of your enterprise, or externally with other companies and organizations. One of the important things about benchmarks and benchmarking is that benchmarks are the standards or the targets that you're aiming for, and benchmarking is the process of closing those gaps, gathering the information you need, including enablers and contextual information to help your organization truly learn how to achieve that higher level of performance. And one of the things about benchmarking, because you're learning from others, is it helps you jump up the levels of performance and really achieve some breakthrough improvements that can then be continuously improved over time. But it gets you to that next level. And also with benchmarking, it's something that has to continuously happen over time. The one constant we all know in our world today is change. So things will change, and it's an important piece of benchmarking to continuously recalibrate performance. Now, the good news is that we've been tracking the use of benchmarking in supply chain over time. And we see that currently about 44% of organizations, and this was out of a sample of over 2,000 participants, about 44% are using it now, but that's anticipated and projected to rise to over 51% by the end of next year. And in terms of its importance as a strategic management tool, we are seeing that 65% of organizations say it is very important, and another 27% say it's important. So benchmarking is a vital step in improving supply chain. But why, right? What can it do? Why do people use it? Well, the number one thing is it helps to size the benefit of opportunities, helps you quantify what those gaps are to close. It helps organizations also establish performance targets, so you're not shooting in the dark, so that your measures are relevant and appropriate, and helps you measure against those targets and make sure you pick the right measures. And at the end, it also helps you prioritize. We all have scarce resources. We need to make the best, most effective use of them. And when we look at how often organizations are benchmarking, 90% are doing it more frequently than once a year. Over half do it quarterly. Another 28% do it monthly. And I think this speaks again to the pace of change that we're dealing with in today's external environment. We have to make sure that we are constantly recalibrating and staying on top of the latest and greatest that's developing. And one area of opportunity is in the percentage of benchmarks that organizations are looking at externally for comparisons when they are trying to set targets or goals. At the median, or the middle 50th percentile, only 25% of metrics are being benchmarked externally. And that is definitely an opportunity for improvement to make sure that, again, you're setting reasonable and appropriate targets. And benchmarking is not without its challenges. The most common obstacle we see among organizations that are looking to benchmark and improve in supply chain is a lack of common definitions or a framework. Because you have to be able to sell the results internally to your stakeholders and your leadership, and you therefore need all your participants to define key terms the same way, and that will ensure your comparisons are valid. There's also a cost to benchmarking, especially if you apply rigor to it. Time, especially on the front end in the planning process, time is money, right? And there are out-of-pocket costs associated with activities like data collection. So I'm going to briefly walk us through now the how to benchmark using 4 phases: plan, setting the strategic direction, narrowing down your benchmarking efforts from trying to solve world hunger to something that is actually benchmarkable; collect, gathering both qualitative and also quantitative data; analyze, understanding the processes and quantifying the opportunities; and then adapting, looking at having a continuous improvement strategy, including how you're going to monitor and report progress. There's an old saying, if you plan to fail, I gave it backwards. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So let's take a look at this important upfront piece of benchmarking. So the most important thing to start with is to make sure you identify and align your benchmarking efforts with the strategic business opportunity that you have in front of you. You want to make sure your benchmarking project is aligned to the key strategies and objectives of the enterprise, and that it cascades from there down to your supply chains, your departments, and even down to the individuals who will be a part of this and impacted by this. And communication is the key to ensuring that this linkage is understood, because we as people always want to understand the what's in it for me. How do I fit into this? And we like to get that feedback when we see the needle move on a key organizational metric. So to help with that, I've included a snapshot of APQC's benchmarking alignment worksheet. This tool really helps synchronize the benchmarking activities by showing the linkages from your overall organizational strategy or goals down to the specific benchmarking questions you may have in your project. This will really help ensure that the time and money you spend is going to result in improvements that do impact the bottom line. So as part of the planning process, you have to scope your project. You need to set those boundaries or those guardrails to say what's in and what's out. That then helps guide the rest of the benchmarking project. And understanding that then helps you work backwards in defining all the pieces you need. One tool that's helpful in scoping this project or any project is a framework like APQC's process classification framework, where work is broken down from categories to process groups, processes, and activities. And what it does is it helps ensure a common vocabulary across all the entities involved in your benchmarking effort, whether it's internal units of your enterprise or external organizations, because you will have these industry and cultural boundaries that you need to bridge by using vocabulary and defining it for everyone participating. Another important piece is process mapping. Situate your process that you're studying inside the context of the organization and the environment. Next, you want to make sure you've identified the process performance measures to study in your benchmarking effort. You want to pick a balanced set. The most common thing we always hear people wanting to benchmark is cost. But while cost is important, it doesn't give you the whole picture. You can drive costs down to zero, right? You can fire all your employees, but that's not where you want to go. So balancing cost effectiveness with staff productivity, process efficiency, cycle time measures, looking at quality, making sure you understand all these different categories of measures that can play on the process involved, and link those measures you pick to your organization's strategy and critical success factors. And one other comment I'll make here is the importance of normalizing measures. What this means is basically getting a common denominator. So if your organization is a large organization and you're learning from some mid-sized organizations or vice versa, you need to be able to mitigate or remove the impact of organizational size. And the way you do this is by normalizing things like per $1,000 of revenue, per full-time equivalent employee performing the process. Get that common denominator so you can compare your numerators, if you will, across entities without regard for size. And it also, one thing I want to say, the blue box on this slide is very important. Before you can benchmark, you have to establish your baseline. You need to know your organization's starting point. Good, bad, whatever it is, you have to collect your own data. Otherwise, you won't know when you've gotten to your destination and how much ground you've covered if you don't have that starting point. It's also important to brainstorm the organizations you want to benchmark against. What kind of organizations do you want to learn from? And I will say the number one thing that comes back all the time is industry peers. But sometimes in certain industries, a particular process is known to be a little less than stellar. And you don't want to be the best of the worst. You want to be the best of the best. So looking outside your industry can sometimes give you those aha moments and those breakthroughs that you couldn't get if you stuck to your own industry peers. Looking at regional peer groups, looking at organizations of similar size, and importantly, organizations with similar characteristics. Are they engineer to order kinds of supply chains, for example? Those are all important in making sure you pick the right organizations to compare yourself to. You also want to consider it from a process mindset, because different companies call different things different names, different functions. But thinking of it as a process and the steps that have to happen can help you get to that common vocabulary with other entities and other organizations. And then you want to plan with the end in mind. So I like to say, what are the headlines you want to be able to report out at the end? And then make sure you collect the data that will enable you to get there. Who's going to use the information? What does it look like when it's completed? What are some of the constraints you might run into? Time, budget, things like that. And then develop a project plan like you would for any other project in the organization. Benchmarking needs to have a timeline associated with it, have milestones identified, and then who's going to do what, the roles and responsibilities. So once you've spent the upfront time doing your homework, if you will, it's time to then start thinking about collecting the benchmarking data. So we want to know when we're doing benchmarking that the questions we're asking really will give us need to know information, not just nice to know. Because you want to respect the time of the external organizations and the other units that you're asking to give you information. Plus, you don't want to create a situation where you have so much data to plow through on the back end. It's hard to separate the important and the valuable information from the rest of it. So make sure you're collecting information that's valuable and readily available. We can't benchmark theory. We can't benchmark things that haven't yet actually happened. And then make sure you're collecting information that organizations are willing to share. If that's a key part of our code of conduct at APQC. Would your organization be willing to share that information? If it's not, then don't ask others to share it with you. Make sure that it's an ethical enterprise, an ethical undertaking that you're doing, so that what you're asking is information that you can then leverage and use for improvement. And you need to have a strategy for how you're going to collect this data. We recommend a series of filters, if you will. Start with who's out there. Do secondary research, which means look at existing information about the landscape for this process. And, you know, I find it interesting. The former head of the Central Intelligence Agency, we'll call it a covert organization, was once quoted as saying, that more than 85% of all CIA research comes from the appropriate analysis of open literature. There's a lot out there. So spend some time doing that secondary research up front to figure out who the most likely candidates are for you to engage with your benchmarking. Then you want to go through and switch to some primary research where you're doing original work, collecting information maybe that doesn't exist. Now, if you're leveraging an organization like APQC that has benchmarks, you don't even have to do some of this yourself. But when you're looking at who's good, you want to put in place a screening process. Then once you've decided that they pass your screening filter, then it's time to collect who's the best. Collect that information through a questionnaire or a survey. And then when you want to get deeper to understand how they do it, that's when it's time to have open-ended questions in an interview. If you have the budget, a site visit is a fantastic way to really get some of the information behind the data and the numbers to understand how organizations are achieving better performance. So once you've collected all your data, now it's time to take a look at it. First step is to validate it. Make sure that you look at it and it's consistent with your scope and definitions. Make sure that logically the answers make sense. Simple things sometimes like, do these pieces of the whole add up to 100%? You can build some of that logic into your actual questionnaire as you're collecting it to make some of this validation easier on the back end. But, look at things like the relationship between number of employees and revenue. Do those seem to make sense? Then it's time to look at a statistical validation and look at that each of those respondents in context with the rest of the data you've collected. Are there any outliers? Do you need to go back and make sure that maybe someone didn't accidentally hit too many zeros on a number? That kind of thing. It's important to do those validation checks when you get your data back. And then normalize your data, as I said, get that common denominator if needed before you start validating, and before you start deeper analysis. Then you're going to want to do some summary or descriptive analysis. What does the data look like? What does it tell you? Start looking for the patterns and the relationships in the data and identify those potential problem areas. And it's important to dig down to find the causes of the gaps. One of the things that we know is that correlation does not imply causation. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. So some of the old school quality improvement techniques can be very helpful here, like asking the 5 whys. Why, until you really get to the root cause of some of this. And then obviously you have to report the results. It's a no-brainer, but just don't forget the importance of tailoring your report to your audience. Consider visual components and synthesize the findings so it's not just a data dump. And then it's always important to understand the change, back to that change management component. Any implementation of a different practice or a change is going to require you to have a change management plan and create that roadmap for what you're going to do with the results once you get them. How is the organization going to make them stick? Because capturing the information is the easier part. Transferring it and getting it reused is a much harder undertaking. And APQC has a whole body of knowledge around knowledge management, looking at how you can get that knowledge transfer to be sticky and to take. And recalibrate and recycle. The importance of putting that information into action and making sure you capture your lessons learned along the way and build in an update process because, as we said, things will change. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And I want to mention the code of conduct. And this is really an important piece of benchmarking. I included a link here, and again, you will all receive these slides in the recording, because you want to make sure that whatever you do is not just legal, but also ethical. And there are several principles of this code of conduct, and it helps anyone who adheres to it, it helps make sure that your benchmarking is professional, as well as protects you from harm and ensures that it's an effective undertaking. So I want to wrap it up with some key critical success factors. Things to remember. So pick the right project. There's many processes in all of our organizations, but you want to make sure you're picking something that links to your strategic focus. What does senior leadership care about? What is the organization's key strategic initiative, or what are your priorities for the coming year? Use an appropriate benchmarking process. Do you need metrics? Do you need practices? Do you need both? Consider all that from the outset. Empower the right teams. Make sure you've got the right mix of skill sets, that you've got the accountabilities defined, that you understand who's doing what. Know your own process first. Cannot overstate the importance of this baseline. Agree to a code of conduct and capture explicit permissions. That's an important piece I didn't mention, which is when you're collecting information from other organizations or even other units in your own organization, you need to let them know what you're going to do with that data, how you will use it. And then be committed to implementing the results. Why would you waste all the time and effort it takes to do a thorough benchmarking project if you're not going to actually then leverage the findings and implement some changes? And then lastly, verify the results of implementation. So a year later, come back and see, did we implement the findings? Did we see an improvement in our processes? Hopefully, yes. If not, why not? And do some root cause analysis. But in addition to understanding what benchmarking is, it's also important to think about what it's not. It's not just industrial tourism, visiting other companies. It's not only looking at your direct competitors, and it's not just crunching numbers. It also is not spying or espionage. Right? It is an above board ethical process, but it's also not quick and easy. So making sure you have a project plan and that the timelines are communicated is important, because everybody, no matter what the question is nowadays, we want the answers immediately, but it takes time to do benchmarking and to do it correctly. But it is a valuable way to compare and improve your organizational performance. Now, if you have any questions, I welcome you to either use the Q&A tool or the chat feature in our webinar now, or you may reach out to me afterwards. I'm always happy to hear feedback and questions from folks. And a few reminders. Everyone who registered will receive a copy of these slides and the recording within 2 business days. And we appreciate if you would take our webinar satisfaction survey when we close the webinar, and visit apqc.org/events for other upcoming webinars and events. And you can always watch our webinars on demand as well. So with that said, I want to respect your time, and I appreciate you attending today's webinar. Thank you very much. And I hope that you continue to connect with APQC, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.